Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And in that world, there's definitely a place for a good horror movie. I know I've said before that I'm a big romance fan and I watch more chick flicks than most straight men will ever admit to. But I also have a soft spot for horror and not just around Halloween. I think there's just something inherently thrilling about being scared. Sometimes our brains just can't tell the difference between being afraid and being excited. It's why thrill seekers exist. It's why skydiving is a thing. But with horror movies, the scary parts work best when there's a decent story laced within all that fear. The story doesn't have to be complicated. Slasher movies like Halloween and Friday the 13th have always followed a fairly basic formula. But they can still work if the plot and characters are compelling. They can even work when the plot goes out of its way to be brutal, bloody, and creepy as hell, like in movies such as Saw, The Exorcist, It, and Annabelle. Those movies know how to make the horror and the jump scares work. But then there's a movie like Smile, a horror movie with a great premise and some legitimately scary overtones, but a movie that ended up feeling incomplete and messy, and not just in terms of blood and violence. You see, whenever Halloween rolls around, I usually make it a point to see at least one horror movie in theaters. And in 2022, I made Smile that movie. And I was genuinely excited about it. When I saw the trailer, I was hooked. I loved the premise, building a bloody horror spectacle around people with creepy smiles. And when I finally saw the movie, I was definitely captivated for the first hour or so. But then, towards the end, it all just fell apart. And it eventually got to a point where the movie became too elaborate for its own good, too afraid to end things at a certain point. And because of that, I walked out of the theater feeling like I only saw a marginally decent horror movie, one that had the potential to be great, but failed to follow through. And that's a real shame too, because this movie really did have a lot going for it. The first 5 minutes perfectly established the unique brand of horror surrounding this movie. It starts in a psychiatric ward where Dr. Rose Cotter, a therapist with a history of past trauma, encounters a disturbed young woman. The woman claims she's being hunted by this terrifying entity. She can't see it directly, but she knows when it's near because it takes the form of real people around her. People who show her this creepy, inhuman smile before it kills her. Naturally, Dr. Carter thinks this woman is just disturbed. But before she can help her, the young woman begins screaming erratically before becoming eerily calm, smiling creepily, and slitting her own throat. And this horrifying act essentially marks Dr. Carter as the next target for this entity. And she spends the rest of the movie trying to uncover its secrets while also trying to escape the same fate as this young woman. The result is a plot that feels very different from your typical slasher or monster movie. Because this entity isn't something that wears a mask or hunts its prey. It feeds directly on the unresolved trauma that others often keep buried, causing them to have nightmares and hallucinate, often seeing more and more people with that creepy, unnatural smile. It also leads to some disturbingly erratic behavior that puts Dr. Carter at odds with her sister, her fiancé, and her co-workers. And with the way this movie is shot, it really feels like we, the audience, are in this woman's traumatized mind. We don't know what's real and what's a hallucination. And this definitely works with both the story and the movie at first. But once we get past a certain point, once Dr. Carter has a better understanding of this entity and what it does, that's where Smile starts to fall apart. Now, there's no one moment where the movie goes completely off the rails, but if there was a turning point, it came after she visited Robert Talley in prison. And as far as anyone knows in this story, he is the only one to survive this Smile entity's wrath. But doing so involved killing someone in front of a witness in order to traumatize them. That way, the entity can pass on to someone else. It's a clear but disturbing rule, and it helps set Robert Talley apart from the others, all of whom died in front of someone else by some strange act of suicide, usually coupled with them casting a witness that creepy, creepy smile. This room reaffirms that this entity is fueled by the trauma its victims experience, and it survives by inflicting new trauma on others. Once Dr. Carter learns about this, she still strives to find a way to survive. But then, the whole story starts to become incoherent and not in a scary, psychological, thrilling sort of way. It eventually gets to a point where it's no longer clear when Dr. Carter is hallucinating or when she's fully coherent. It's also not clear how her approach to escaping the smile entity is supposed to save her or end the cycle. Since she's not willing to kill someone like Robert Talley did, she thinks she can overcome this by confronting her own past trauma. We do learn early on in the movie that she witnessed her mother's suicide at a young age. And understandably, this really affected her. It likely played a part in her going on to become a therapist. But the issue surrounding this trauma is something she's never fully confronted. Yes, she has talked about it, even getting therapy herself. But she's never actually dealt with it beyond a certain point, and this smile entity preyed on that. So logically, Dr. Carter believes the solution is to confront her trauma more directly. She actually travels back to her abandoned family home, the same home in which her mother killed herself. And there, she hopes to confront both her past and the smile entity. She goes so far as to call the entity out, letting it know that if she dies alone without traumatizing anyone else, it's done for. It can't continue. It can't spread. And while her logic does seem sound, the spectacle that unfolds really just comes off as blind spectacle. And at this point, Smile becomes less a creepy horror movie and more a generic monster movie. We see the Smile creature take a real form, but in doing so, that ends up taking away from the horror that was definitely there early on. And once it takes this form, the story is no longer about Dr. Carter confronting her trauma. It's basically her in a final boss battle, not unlike the last girl in a generic slasher movie. Except in Smile, she's not the last girl, she's the only girl. This story all unfolds from her perspective, and because of that, the way things play out feel messy and ultimately unsatisfying. Now, I won't spoil all the details, mostly because it's actually hard to put into words how the final 20 minutes of the movie play out. And that's because so much of it jumps from hallucination to hallucination. One minute, Dr. Carter is fighting the Smile monster in a burning house. The next, she's confiding in Joel, her ex-boyfriend who's been helping her out this whole time. But even that ends up being a hallucination as well, and at every turn, there are these poor attempts at jump scares and twists that just get old really fast. By the time the movie finally does end, it's almost a relief. We still don't know if this is just another hallucination, and at this point, nothing is really clear. So there's a whole lot of ambiguity, as well as an overt attempt to set up a sequel, as tends to be the case with many horror movies. But in the process, the ending to this movie just falls flat. In trying to follow those last 20 minutes of the movie, you get the sense that it had a more coherent ending in mind, but then Smile was reshot and retooled extensively, probably to leave things more ambiguous and make room for a sequel. And now I get that on some levels. Every studio wants a franchise, especially ones that don't require the massive budgets of superhero movies. For reference, Smile was shot for less than $20 million, and since it ended up making over $200 million at the box office, it's fair to say it turned a profit. So a sequel is all but certain. But I also think the success of this movie has more to do with the first two acts than it does the ending. Because even if that ending fell flat, the movie was solid for the most part. The premise and the visuals are still great, but the messy, ambiguous nature of the final act, I feel like it really undermined the true substance of this movie. Because once everything became a hallucination within a hallucination, once every 5 minutes required a new jump scare, Smile lost track of its own story. And it left the journey of Dr. Carter feeling incomplete, despite the messy details of her ultimate fate. That doesn't mean the movie had to have a happy ending, it just means the ending we got didn't fit with everything leading up to it. Now, maybe a future sequel will do a better job of exploring this premise. The idea of the Smile monster, a creature that haunts, terrorizes, and ultimately spreads through trauma, that is a legitimately great idea for a horror franchise, and it definitely sets itself apart from typical slashers, ghouls, and monster tropes. But even a great premise needs a complete story, and that's what Smile ultimately lacked. But that's just my opinion. If you have a taste for horror and want something different from your typical Friday the 13th ripoff, I say give Smile a chance. Let me know if you feel differently about it. For me personally, I still liked Smile, but in the end, it still feels like a missed opportunity rather than a legitimately horrifying cinematic experience. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and until next time, take care and stay safe.